So how have what I call the supply chain responded? Well, first of all, I want to look at what I call the representative bodies. So these are the MLAs and the other organisations like that. So if you look at grain growers have some targets they have set, and this is this magic 2030 number. They want a 15% reduction in emissions intensity by 2030. That is their industry target, and we'll delve into emissions intensity more in a minute. They also want to halve the embedded emissions, the inputs, so that's scope 3 by 2040, and you'll see that when we go into the cropping one, why the amount of emissions you're inheriting in scope 3 in the cropping game is huge. And so anything that can impact on that would be most welcome as far as your endpoint calculation goes, and carbon neutrality by 2050, because that's that national standard. If you look at the Red Meat Advisory Committee, now everybody lumps this on MLA. MLA are actually the group that are tasked with implementing it, but it's the Red Meat Advisory Committee that makes up feedlotters and a whole lot of others that came up with this carbon neutrality thing, not MLA. MLA are just the bunnies that have to implement it. They got out of the blocks pretty early, and I think they're sort of regretting it now when they actually realise what that requires. So MLA's Carbon Neutral 30 roadmap, as everybody's probably heard of, their CN30 program commits to being carbon neutral by 2030. Then now I hear them talking a bit about climate neutral rather than carbon neutral because of the methane thing that's going on. But in fact, if you actually look at the roadmap that's in there and you look at their stretch targets, roughly half of their pathway to getting to zero emissions is through tree planting on land in southern Australia. And I reckon you've heard boo about that, but that's where about 50%, when I've done my back of the envelope calculations, that's where about 50% of that pathway to carbon neutrality is actually going to come from credits in tree planting. So we might just park that for a minute. It's not going to come from having carbon neutral cattle. Wool didn't have a clue what they were doing, so they just jumped on board what the Red Meat Advisory Committee said. So basically they have exactly the same targets as the Red Meat Advisory Committee. Dairy industry is slightly different. They've looked into it. Well, they've been onto it earlier, and so I think they've got a better handle on it before they were guessing at numbers that sort of Mick was alluding to this morning of how do you influence those numbers. Theirs was a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions intensity, not emissions, by 2030 from 2010-11. So 30% over a 20-year time frame, as opposed to grain growers, which is sort of looking over about a 10-year time frame. So they've been a little bit more lenient or realistic, depending on what frame you want to come from, in what their targets are. But fair to say that each of the representative bodies has a target of lowering emissions. And so it's not going to be something that's going to go away with the just a change in a few people. It's policy that'll be driving this. If you look at the actual supply chain, Richard Eckhart's got lots and lots of examples from overseas. I'll just pull up 3 that I've got here that are local to us. For grains, I've mentioned this one before, Malt Europe, 30% reduction in emissions intensity by 2030 from 2022 baseline. We're still confirming with Malt Europe at the moment. Their senior managers from Europe are coming out in early November, and we're going to sit down with them and actually set a proper number rather than just a 30% reduction type discussion. And the only reason why I can do that is we've actually got some figures on what's fair and reasonable for barley in this part of the world to achieve. Dairy, Fonterra have got a 30%, they call it intensity reduction, so that's emissions intensity from scope 1 and 3 emissions by 2030 from 2018. Greenham's have got one, which I mentioned before, and theirs is if you can reach a standard of 9.2 kilos of CO2 equivalents for every kilo of live weight you produce. So that's what's called their tier 3 standard, and there are lots of other environmental sustainability standards you've got to tick as well, not just the carbon one. But if you clear all those hurdles and you become a tier 3 supplier, they currently will provide add an extra 10 cents per kilo to any beef that you sell to them in live weight. So as I said, if you've got lots to sell, it makes worthwhile. one farmer said that he spent a day and a half getting all the paperwork and stuff together, which seems like a lot, but I think he made an extra $30,000 on the sale to them. So it was sort of worthwhile from that point of view. But I think the message to take out of this is supply chain is trying to come up with these numbers and targets and timeframes as well. And we're just going to see more of this come out in the future. I've mentioned a few times about this idea of emissions intensity, and it was raised earlier because the supply chain have understood that the zero emission stuff's too far away, but efficiency is something that everybody can get on board with. So emissions intensity is simply your emissions per unit of product, whatever that product is that you're selling. So it could be a litre of milk, could be a tonne of grain, could be a kilo of beef. Whatever it is, it's an efficiency measure that they're looking for, and they're setting targets around those efficiency measures. Why? Primarily because of Scope 3, because you're a Scope 3 supplier to them, and they need to try and buy from people that are lower emissions per tonne or kilo of product that you're actually supplying to them. We do have some industry benchmarks. They are pretty rubbery. So for grains, it's between 0.1 and 0.5 kilo of CO2 per kilo of grain. For Malt Europe, when we've been doing some studies, that's the sort of range that we've been in. So it's actually very wide at the moment, mainly because people don't know much stuff. Haven't got very good numbers yet. But AgVic just did some stuff in a framework, a program that they're doing, and that came out at 18 kilos of CO2 equivalent live weight. But they've, I think, made a few blues in that, which I'll talk about a bit later. Prime lambs, you've got that sort of range, and wool, you've got that sort of range. So we do at least have some broad ballpark figures if we're looking at emissions intensity or looking at efficiencies. They're in your notes, all of those numbers as well, plus a few others. I think the main reason or main value I get out of these is if someone's done a calculation and their emissions intensities are widely outside that sort of range, then they've probably entered some data incorrectly. So I find this is a really good first check when someone says, oh, I've done my numbers. Oh yeah, what was your emissions intensity? And they go, oh, CO2 per kilo live weight. I think, nah, you've stuffed something up there, because you can't get 3 with what we're currently doing at the moment, or it's not going to be 30. So it helps you just get an idea of whether they're in the ballpark or not. So where's the value in this emissions intensity? I really like it, and I think we should focus on this when you're engaging early on with your farmers, with your growers, because there's a lot to come out of this emissions intensity story when you calculate it. And I'll just share with you, and I'm happy for people to use our slides if you want, of how this emissions intensity story comes together. For the beef side of our operation, so we're about half beef, half sheep at home, we've produced roughly around that 700 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents from our beef side of it. We had the numbers. I was actually able to go back to 2006-07 and plug those numbers in. Just remembering, if the emissions intensity, the global warming potential 100 changes for methane from 28 to 27, that line will change a bit, because this includes emissions from carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, all converted to carbon dioxide equivalents. That's what the C2OE means. But you can see it's roughly steady. But over that same period, the beef that we've produced has gone from around about 60,000 kilos of live weight to about 80,000 kilos over the same time. So even though it bounces around from year to year, good year, bad year, all that sort of stuff, the trend is upwards. Okay, about a 25% increase in in production, beef produced, but at the same time with the same amount of emissions. So when you divide one by the other, because emissions intensity is your emissions per unit of product, so you divide that line by that line, you get a emissions intensity line that looks like that. So that's how our emissions intensity have tracked over the last 15 years. Now, if you start to put some of those benchmarks that I was talking about before on it, that's where the beef range is. So the Beef Sustainability Framework, when they did a lot of measurements over the years, that's sort of the range where the beef industry fell per kilo of live weight. The target, the average target for the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework is saying producers should be around about that 13.1 kilos or below. And if you put Greenham's on it, which is 9.2, we're currently tracking at around about 9. So we would qualify for the Greenham's Tier 3 standard and that bonus of that extra 10 cents if we wanted to sell to them. So that's where I think the value, if you can start to understand not only your emissions, but also the amount of product that you're turning off as well, this efficiency measure becomes a really useful one. And this is the sort of number that most of the supply chain don't know yet. So they're guessing at numbers, or they're just using percentage decreases over time because they don't actually know what that number is. So the more farmers we've got that credibly know their emissions intensity number, the better position the industry will be to actually set some fair and reasonable targets. What I think about this one is we've done all of this without any fancy counting of sequestration. We haven't counted one tree in getting to that number. That's just been done purely through productivity with available technologies that are out there at the moment that we've adopted over time to get that to go down. Before I move on? No? Okay, I'll move on to the next bit. All right, I want to touch a little bit from the supply chain because there's been a lot of criticism leveled at them around greenwashing. And that's because there haven't been standards set. So any company could claim that they're X, Y, or Z, and it was really difficult for the consumer to be able to know whether that was true or not. And there were lots of people volunteering, or not volunteering, getting paid to help them in the carbon space, doing the calculations and all that stuff and helping with their claims that were of a great range of credibility and integrity. So to try and address this greenwashing, in 2015, there was a initiative called the Science-Based Target Initiative that was set up. I should say in Australia, both ASIC and claims by people that they're either low carbon or carbon neutral. So in Australia, we do have two regulators that supposedly are keeping an eye on this sort of stuff. Depends on how strongly you think the ASIC and the ACCC actually do their job around this greenwashing. But in Australia, we do actually have a legislated mechanism of being able to chase after that. But the important one is this Science-Based Target Initiative, and they have a subsection of that, which is the forestry, land and agriculture sector. So it's targeted specifically at ag and forestry. It's called the FLAG. And this sets more specifically what the expectations are as far as standardising methods internationally for companies that want to make claims around carbon emissions, carbon neutrality, and auditing and stuff like that. So it's actually a really powerful document. It's voluntary tool that's come onto the market to help straighten up the non-government stuff, the non-compliant stuff, the voluntary stuff, which a lot of companies are operating in. They're not engaged with the government stuff. They're doing this voluntarily. This is helping to straighten everybody up and put them on the right path. To enter the Science-Based Targets Initiative and to get accredited for that, you need to set 5 and 10-year targets, and you need to set a 2050 target as well. So companies in their submission to get registered have to set 5, 10-year targets, 2050 carbon neutral targets as well. They're expected to achieve some carbon removals through sequestration. So sequestration is certainly on the table. It's not just keep reducing your emissions For a lot of companies, they'll say, yep, it's legit. You can go and buy carbon credits, some frustration somewhere else, as part of your claim. That they do put some strict rules around what credits are considered legitimate or not. I'll delve into that in a tick. You must commit to zero deforestation by 2050. Now, that's when we think of deforestation, you probably think more so the rainforests in South America. But Australia's actually got caught up in this because the definition that's going around, particularly by the EU, would snare some Northern Australian properties that are still doing land clearing in an odd way, where they're actually removing regrowth, and that's being caught at the moment under this deforestation definition. All right, so yeah, so part of what's in this flag part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is that any company that signs up has to achieve zero deforestation by 2050. So that means from their suppliers as well. There's been an issue in Australia because the definition that's being used would snag some Northern Australian farmers that are clearing some regrowth off what used to be grazing, regrowth of those trees. So there's a bit of argy-bargy at the moment about the definition around what deforestation is, particularly in the Australian context. So the Australian government actually deferred signing up to the deforestation agreement only a month or so ago to allow for further consultation, because they may inadvertently collect some Northern Australian farms, which would then mean that companies that have signed up to the science-based targets wouldn't be able to buy from them because they're not meeting their zero deforestation commitments. Excuse me. We also need to set targets for for fossil fuel emissions. So they're very hot on reducing the energy side of it, and use in the energy side. With the target by 2050 for agriculture is to reduce emissions by 72%. So remember when I said this carbon neutral by 2050, it's a global thing people are talking about. Some sectors do not have to achieve neutrality, and agriculture is one of them. So there's an expectation to be 72% less by 2050, not zero. Okay. So just to delve into that a little bit further, this is, for example, this is what Heineken have committed. So they have signed up to the FLAG agreement, the Science-Based Targets, the FLAG agreement, and they have agreed to reduce absolute Scope 3 FLAG emissions. So they're from their suppliers, so by 2040 from a 2022 base year. So that is their commitment by 2040. Okay. And I could have rattled off 200 companies that have got these types of statements, many of which we supply to. Okay. So this is real, and it's something that's going to affect us in the relatively near future. If you actually delve in, so you can go into the Science-Based Targets website and you can find out who's committed to what. I just dived into this 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I pulled out some of the agricultural related groups. So there's one called food production from non-animal sources. So that would be any grains and cropping type stuff. Food production from animals, and then the food and beverage processing. So if you look at globally who's committed to it, a lot of the food processors have, and some of the food companies are now. Now, you can make a commitment to say we're aiming to reduce our absolute emissions by X amount, like Heineken have done up here. You then submit how you're going to do that, how you're going to achieve that commitment. You set targets along the way, and you set the measurement and auditing that you will be doing to verify those commitments. They get submitted to an independent panel in the Science Based Target Initiative, and quite often they are rejected because the level of measurement and auditing and the targets that have been set and the method you're claiming you will reach that level of emissions reduction is not considered legitimate from a scientific point of view. So you'll have quite a lot that are committed, and then you'll see over time a number of them that pull out because simply what the company is committing to, the independent panel don't believe will achieve what they're claiming they'll achieve. So they then science-based targets side of it. Okay, in Australia, as you can see, we're very late to the party. Of the 750 globally that committed, there's 11 that have made commitments in Australia. Again, mainly in the food processing. GrainCorp's the only one from a grain point of view, and they have committed, but they haven't had any of their targets approved. So at the moment, they're just preparing a case to put forward of what they're aiming to achieve, what their interim targets are, and how they'll achieve them. You can see some other companies that have gone a little bit further down the path, and that's in the processing side of it. So very few in Australia at the moment. I think that's the reason why the Science Based Targets Initiative we haven't heard much of, hasn't meant much to us. But I think it'll come in a bit of a flurry, particularly as some of these global companies then start reaching out to their supply chain and having those effects. So watch this space. It's going to be real. What I like about it is that it's removing people that are making dubious claims, and the sector's been full of it up until now. So this over time will help straighten that up because of the requirements to have a very strong scientific basis for the claims and for the auditing process. Okay, I've put a few things in your notes. One was around the different policies. So that's the grain growers policy, the red meat policy, the sheep policy, the wool policy, and also the flag. I call it types, but basically they're the rules under which you'd operate if you were doing the flag bit. So that's the forestry and ag bit of the Science Based Target Initiative. So they're the 5 that I've put in for that private sector side of things. Do you want me to keep rolling on, Em, and then I have a bit of a discussion?
We'll have a quick discussion, Cam, just on that section.
You want to? Because these other 2 haven't got much in them.
What have you've got private and then what?
A little bit on private, and then it's the First Nation stuff, which I've got nothing on.
All right, we can do it after those 2 and combine it.
Okay, I think because the 3, just think of them all as supply chain type stuff. Okay, so we'll move on with that one. If we look at the private sector side of it, as you can probably expect, when governments create rules and requirements, and companies through their shareholders or at their own whim are deciding that they want to make certain claims, that there's an opportunity that then arises for the private sector to provide services to these organisations that are trying to achieve certain outcomes. So there's been a big growth in this area at the moment, what I call the private providers in the carbon space, and they'll provide you assistance in ways to reduce emissions and increase sequestration, so they can give you advice. So there are lots of companies out there that will give you advice, tend to be a bit more heavily skewed on the increasing sequestration advice than the reducing emissions advice, but they're out there and they should be able to do both. They will also help in doing your calculations around both emissions and sequestration, and there are some groups that are specialised for certain enterprises. In fact, there's a huge number of them in the accounting firms, the big accounting firms, not necessarily working in ag, but working in lots of other companies as well. They will help you work towards certification, such as Climate Active, which is a government-endorsed certification scheme, or through some other independent certification schemes that are international. They can help you get that accreditation and, if you like, put a label on your product or make a claim about your product through different levels of certification. And they're more than eager to help you create and register carbon farming projects if you want to go down that path. So a lot of them are very keen to help you out. Their fee structure is very different. Some of them want to take all the money up front. Some of them will take it all in ACCUs if they're created. They have their pros and cons with that, particularly with the ACCU part of it. It does open up a whole world of then who has incumbents over your land and what you can do with it if they have a stake in the credits that are being generated, as opposed to paying them $1 fee upfront. In Australia, we have what's called the Carbon Market Institute. I don't know if anybody's had any dealings with the Carbon Market Institute. It's a voluntary organisation that's been set up. It's got about 150 members. So a number of the carbon providers are members of the Carbon Market Institute. And this is meant to be the peak body for this carbon stuff, not just for ag, but for carbon projects in all sectors, of which ag they pick up as a part of that. The Carbon Market Institute have developed a Australian Carbon Industry Code of Conduct, and a number of those service providers have signed up to that. The Code of Conduct has got things in it like what you should disclose to a client, what you can and can't do, advice, integrity, credibility, all of those sort of things. Now, it's a voluntary code of, and as good as or bad as code of conducts are, we had a code of conduct for the banking sector, and then we had a Royal Commission. There's a voluntary code of conduct for the supermarkets, and then we're having a supermarket inquiry. So code of conducts, take them as you see fit, whether you think they've got any value in them or not. But you'll see some carbon providers in Australia have this sticker on it, Australian Code of Conduct, as part of it. Just what that really means, I'm not going to make a claim on. I'll just put these next two slides up because you may recognise some of the private carbon providers. So that's just a few. These were the initial ones, so you may know names like Carbon Friendly that have been around for a decade or so. AgriProve's pretty active at the moment, but there are lots of different carbon providers out there. Anybody can put their shingle out and call themselves a carbon provider. Call myself a carbon provider tomorrow if I wanted to. So there's no restriction on that. If you sign up to the Carbon Market Institute, then there are some expectations, because that's meant to be the peak body and sets some professional standards, but that's about as far as it goes. So that's when the code first launched, but here's just another bunch of them in Australia that are operating. Okay, so just about every rock you lift up, you'll find a new carbon provider out there. I often get asked, what do you think of this group or that group? My answer is I don't know, because I don't know them well enough. But what I equip them with, and we'll get into this probably tomorrow morning, is what I have like a checklist of questions that a carbon credit that's got some integrity to it. And so if you can ask your private provider about those sort of things and they all get ticks with those, then they're probably reasonable ones to deal with, putting the cost structure and stuff like that aside. Internationally, there's 1,000 more of these. These are just ones that are operating in Australia at the moment, and I'm sure there's another few that should be added to the list in the last month. So it's a pretty competitive space, and they'll offer different services and different promises on the way through. In the US, globally, there are some ratings groups out there that will rate the quality of each of these credits that are created through them. But any of these companies are free to create their own credits. They don't have to create ACCUs. So and around the world, there are some governments that issue credits under the government's name and therefore government backing. Australia has one for Australia, but if you go to the US, there is no US equivalent to ACCUs. But some states in America have created their own carbon credits. So California has its own carbon credit scheme, but not all states do. And this is the same all around the world. Some governments do not run carbon credit schemes. So Australia's a bit unique in that side of it, that the Australian government sort of got in first, created a big market, which is, I think, limited number of private operators that are out there. But we'll explore that a bit more. Okay, and so with something like this, it's quite possible for people to claim carbon neutrality based on the calculations that a company may have done, and using certain rules. So there are different ways that you can claim carbon neutrality, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with government. And an example that I've just tossed in here is, people may have heard of Jigsaw Farms, Mark Wood and Eve Cantor. For a number of years, they were claiming carbon neutrality, and they were claiming carbon neutrality on the back of a research paper, peer-reviewed research paper that was published in 2006. So Natalie Doran-Brown did that one. I've stuck that in there so you can see the calculations or the lengths they went to claim carbon neutrality for Jigsaw Farms. It's interesting that Jigsaw Farms now, another report's been done, is no longer carbon neutral. Two of the issues that have altered that status is one, when this one was calculated, they used methane at a global warming potential of 21, and now it's 28. So it's 30% higher, even though they can theoretically running exactly the same number of animals, they're emitting 30% more, and their trees have matured at a way that they're not capturing as much carbon as was envisaged. So just put this one up to just warn people about the claims of carbon neutrality. With the moving of the goalposts and the more stuff that we learn over time, some of those claims can be difficult to justify over time, and certainly can change over time. So you think you're carbon neutral and you're not anymore. And then the last one I've got there, M, was just the farmer and First Nations opportunities, and I reckon we got a good thrashing of that in the training stuff that we did previously. So I basically don't have any slides for that. But we've picked up the low-hanging fruit from here down to here. Okay, our sheep job's looking better, but our cattle job is about probably as good as we're going to get with the technology we've got. We'll pick up a bit of genetics. Our pastures are good. There are pastures that obviously reduce emissions and have greater tannins and oils in them. But at the moment, the calculators can't recognise it, so I can't show it here. An example like this, I could do it, but the calculators won't allow me to have any recognition for doing it. So we've sort of exhausted all we can that the calculator can show in reducing those emissions until we start to get some other technologies and the calculators catch up in being able to include those positive changes into the system. Depends how credible you want to be with them. We can't create ACCUs out of it, because our trees have already been planted. And when you talk about additionality and newness, we don't qualify for any of that. If you wanted to make an estimate of the carbon that has been captured of the recently planted historically that we know are still growing and capturing, yep, we can do that. We'll talk about that tomorrow when I get you to do some runs on full cam from a tree sequestration point of view. But all of those are non-government. So the claims we might be making either with our soils or with our trees are not to create ACCUs, but potentially to create other types of voluntary credits that whether the marketplace accepts them or not is entirely up to the marketplace.